Happy Monday. How's it going, everyone?
Happy
Howdy.
Monday. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank
What's
you.
up,
It's a
Sarah?
pleasure to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. Cool. So for people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a general partner at Amplify Partners, which is an early stage venture capital firm. We do seed and Series A investments, but we focus primarily on investing in technical tools and platforms. So generally speaking, I would kind of like characterize our investments as developer tools, enterprise infrastructure, and then perhaps not shockingly, given the nature of our conversation today, data and ML tools and platforms. We also do look at some vertical applications of those underlying technologies, whether it's like databases, distributed systems, machine intelligence. I primarily focus on data and ML tools and platforms, largely because that's where my operating experience was. So I started my career as a data scientist in the defense and intelligence sector, gradually kind of worked my way into startups. And then most recently led the data team at a company called Mattermark that was collecting data on other startups, selling it to investors. So that's how I made my way to the dark side.
Shout out to Mattermark, by the way. I was a big fan of the research that you guys had back in the day. I'd read the reports religiously, and it was excellent work. So miss the
Well,
miss the
thank
data.
you.
Yeah. So, yeah, of course.
I appreciate that. I mean, I certainly am kind of like reflecting upon it, feel really grateful that like I had the opportunity to build a data team at a company that was actually like productizing its data, that was selling reports, that was building kind of like an interactive analysis environment for other investors. In retrospect, like the opportunity to build a data team at a company that was not just using data to kind of inform their product direction, but actually productizing data was like rather different. So.
That's really cool. Yeah, and I mean, kind of early on as you got started over at Amplify, I mean, how did those experiences influence your investment approach?
Yeah. So for some additional context, I spent like a year and a half of generalist investing at a firm called Canvas before I actually joined Amplify. But even during my tenure at Canvas, I feel like my first set of investment hypotheses, or the markets in which I was seeking to make investments, were largely informed by my own experiences. Um, Now, in thinking about it, I feel like there were some things that I was looking for that would have been like too early to market back then. So, for example, one of the kind of acute pain points that we had faced during my tenure at Mattermark was associated with monitoring our ML models, or I guess to be more faithful, monitoring our ML pipelines. We would see, for example, like trends related to some of our classification models, and it was difficult to know, like, is the model performing erratically? Is the world just weird? Is there an issue with our pipelines? Um, so I, upon entering investing, started to look a little bit more at categories like this. Of course, I think what I found out was that like not that many companies were actually deploying models in production environments. And so like there wasn't really an acute market need. But that's just kind of an example of a pain point that I felt myself, where like as an investor, I sought to find solutions that would address that problem for a broader set of practitioners.
Interesting.
You'll
Do,
be
do you feel like you were able to get into the data investing space fairly early? Maybe that's not entirely fair because there was a whole wave of investment around the big data movement in Hadoop.
Mhm.
And then it seems like maybe there was a slight winter. And then there was this new wave of startups which have become associated with the modern data stack, which of course is part of the topic of our show. But were you able to jump on that like next wave early based on your experience?
That's a great question. So oftentimes like data practitioners who are interested in venture will reach out to me. And one of the questions that they sometimes ask is like, how do you actually leverage your data experience as an investor? Now I think like perhaps like many people who are transitioning from data into investing, like the first instinct is to actually apply like data scientific methods to find new investments. And I think that is more of what I did during my time at Canvas. So it wasn't actually applying my data background to invest in data and ML tools and platforms, but rather trying to collect signals on early stage and kind of like growth stage startups to detect the best investments. I think what I realized over the course of my experience in venture is that like those signals are incredibly noisy. There's strong incentives not to share information as a startup. And what's more, a lot of the information kind of experiences like a pretty strong lag. So for example, with like reports about funding, like those are usually somewhere between like 3 months to a year late relative to like when the deal actually closes. So I think like I realized after like immersing myself more in venture that like a data scientific approach, particularly to early stage investing, was problematic. But then started kind of like shifting my focus to like how can I actually use my experience, like use my network, use my empathy for people who have the role that I had previously to find like new tools for data practitioners. In some ways, I actually think I was a little bit late to like the phenomena around the modern data stack, and I think sometimes it can actually be tough to invest in the categories that you know best because you have such strong biases due to your past experiences. For example, like it took me a while to get DBT. I saw it and I was like, okay, so this is just a tool to create tables and materialized views. Like what's so important about that? But I think, as I started to spend more time with people and learn how they were using tools like DBT, learn how they were using, their data warehouse, my experience informed my empathy. My experience enabled me to have kind of like richer, more complex conversations with, former colleagues, with new friends, and that ended up, shaping my investing strategy. Even though, early on, I was probably more cynical than most.
That's really interesting because when I think of your investments, DBT comes to mind as one of the kind of the poster children, not only of Amplify's portfolio but also the modern data stack. And so, that's interesting. I didn't know this, that you sort of had like a bias, and it was a bit it was a bit of a mental switch for you for DBT. Like what caused that switch to flip where you're like, okay, I get it, can throw some money at this?
Yeah. No, I think like early on, like I was looking at a lot of things like as a set of technologies rather than as a kind of foundation upon which you could build a set of practices. To me, like what's most important about DBT is not the fact that it enables you to create tables and materialized views, but rather kind of the culture around analytics engineering and establishing a tool for core data modeling. So if you think about core data modeling as being kind of essential to various analytics, data science workflows, and DBT as the tool that unlocks kind of rigorous practice, bring software engineering practices to core data modeling, then I think you can really see why it's such an important company. But if you're thinking about it just purely from like a technological view of like, Jinja templating engine allows you to like create tables and materialized views, then I think you lose the plot. So I guess to kind of answer your question, it was more thinking about like the modern data stack in terms of the practices, the culture that it enables, rather than like purely from a technical standpoint, thinking about like, leveraging like the latest research or establishing kind of competitive moats through technical defensibility and things like that.
Interesting.
Well, it seems to me that one of the big challenges in moving into investing would be the fact that as you were saying, there just aren't a lot of signals in data early on. And a lot of it does come down to the people you're involved with. So you've used the word empathy, culture. You've talked about conversations, about how people are using tools. Obviously, it sounds like you were managing teams before. And so some of those human elements were there. But how was it to learn like how to interact with founders and with early teams and to learn who was going to be a good team who could build a good product for you? How did you go about that process when you got into investing?
Yeah, great question. I think like so many people, when I first transitioned into investing, like my goal was really to like find deals. And so I think again, this kind of led me down like, let me find the most interesting set of technologies. Let me, mine the research domain for people who are pushing the limits of databases, who have, new ML model architectures and things like that. Um, Over the course of my investing career, I think like what I've realized is that it's much better to like put yourself in the path of interesting people. So I'll go into a conversation, with someone not knowing like if they have like founder ambitions or if they'd like to join a startup or really with like any clear intention or goal. Um, Instead, I've learned to go into those conversations just wanting to have a good conversation on, a topic of interest. Um, and I find again that by just kind of putting myself in the path of people, ideas, projects, trends that are interesting, I am kind of more compelling investments than I would if I was like just focused on like finding, quote unquote, like innovative technologies.
So
But
you don't pay attention to like the hype cycle and see where the categories are and the Gartner hype cycle and all that kind of stuff.
I mean,
I
I
guess how much
do, I
would
do.
that play it? Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
I absolutely do. But I think like, um, rather than like trying to find like the companies that are at the top of the hype cycle, like instead, I think
Yeah,
like what I'm doing is spending a lot of time talking to like practitioners, talking to people who are building their stacks, talking to people who are building their own internal tools and
yeah,
platforms, rather than buying certain um, solutions from vendors. And it's those
yeah.
conversations that kind of like help me dissect like what is hype and what is reality.
For sure. I mean, that's how we met actually a couple years ago in Utah when you were living out here. You was like, "You want to get lunch and just have a chat?" I'm like, "Sure." So and that's how we met. And I thought that approach was, well, I mean, it was just cool. Like, it was a good conversation, and and here we are today, right? So it's
Yeah.
cool because you never know who you're gonna run into and who they might know as well. And so yeah, I kind of find out that the data world is just incredibly small. And so a lot of people know each other, and not only that, but a lot of people talk about ideas. Slack communities that definitely spawned up around COVID, and but more interestingly, I find just everyone's talking to each other. I think more so than they probably did before, just because it's a lot easier to nowadays. So, which means just a lot of ideas come about, and I guess one of the ideas we're going to talk about is the modern data stack and potentially moving on from it. I think it's a conversation that Matt and I have had. I think when we talked about the topic for the chat, Sarah, it was I thought that was awesome. So let's dig into this. Why are we moving on from the modern data stack? Or
So, I mean, I think like it's an open question. Are we moving on modern data stack? I'd actually make the argument that I think like a lot of teams are kind of like settling into the modern data stack, but upon settling into the tools and platforms that they have, I think like the next step will be to move on. Um, uh, so instead, maybe I'll answer the question like, why should we move on from the modern data stack? Um, maybe just to like level set for a second too. Like when I think about the modern data stack, I'm generally kind of describing the tools, platforms, principles, wherein people move data into a data warehouse, typically through an ELT tool or process. They transform data within the data warehouse into a set of core data models. Perhaps they'll use some sort of metric solution to enable like fast slice and dice within a interactive data environment or BI platform. So your typical kind of like Snowflake 5-tran hex, maybe you have a data activation platform like High Touch in there too. And I think like all of those tools and those practices are actually incredibly valuable. I think like the modern data stack enables data teams to build like great kind of executive dashboards and reporting applications. So I think like the modern data stack is actually very well suited to kind of like BI executive reporting. And really like a lot of the foundational capabilities that a data team ought to be able to provide before moving on to kind of more complex like predictive analysis, machine learning, experimentation, and so on and so forth. So like I do believe in the modern data stack as a great set of tools that unlock, again, those BI reporting, descriptive analytics use cases. I think where we've tricked ourselves is kind of in two respects. The first is that like this modern data stack is actually well suited to the development of interactive applications. The set of tools that I described, like they were not purpose built for building like rich interactive applications. They were not designed to support thousands or millions of concurrent users. They were not designed to kind of like enable the development of like more complex interfaces or to support certain update patterns. So I think we are tricking ourselves and thinking that the data warehouse and the modern data stack can actually like support the development of like quote unquote data products beyond the use cases that I was describing before. I think the other thing that perhaps data teams are like deluding themselves into believing is that like there is this perfect representation of data that exists, and if you just complete a certain set of like transformations, you can establish this either set of tables or a collection of metrics that will unlock any use case that will enable any person within the business to answer any question. And so I think like perhaps to put that point more concisely, we've become a little bit too obsessed with data modeling and thinking about, again, this perfect representation of the business, rather than acknowledging that they're kind of like good enough data models that can support like a large set of questions, but not like an exhaustive set of questions. And these kind of crude, imperfect, but like good enough data models are probably good enough. So it's really those two things that I think like will require us to move beyond the modern data stack. It's thinking beyond data modeling, and it is developing richer interactive data applications, including those that can be used by external users.
And so it sounds to me like the general theme here is that you're talking about a product-oriented approach to data, and specifically not just an internal product where my customer is the CEO and maybe the C-suite and some VPs, but actually an external-facing product where it's built into my SaaS platform and all of my customers can use it, thousands or potentially millions of customers, and that this is informing the way that you're thinking about modeling. So instead of building a general purpose model, build a model to focus on a product, but make it general enough so it's not super rigid. Am I interpreting that correctly?
You nailed it. I mean, I think it is perhaps like even broader than that. So like certainly I think like if you have like an external user, a customer facing application, there's kind of going to be a set of product requirements that go in hand with that. But I think even in moving again beyond these kind of executive dashboards, BI reporting use cases, a phrase that a colleague used that I'd like to see more, not to coin another term in the modern data stack ecosystem, is goal-driven analysis. So in both contexts, I think it's the idea that like our goals or a set of like product requirements or a set of insights that need to be delivered in order to make a decision, like that is prioritized. And the modern data stack, et cetera, is a means to that end. I think we've just become a little bit too obsessed with like the means and have lost sight of the ends.
I'm trying to mute here. That's an interesting observation. I think I don't know. It's different than what I've seen with data modeling, for example, where I think like the data modeling that I've seen with modern data stack users has been almost an absence of modeling in some sense, which I guess you can argue is also a model. It's just a kind of a crappy one. So what's really interesting was, and it could be a feature, it could be a bug. But for example, at Coalesce, I knew some guys giving a talk there on data modeling, and some friends of mine are actually standing in the back of that talk, watching people type in, "What is data modeling?" I guess 80% of the room didn't know basic data modeling techniques, and barely anyone knew Kimball, for example. So that was pretty shocking because it's at a transformation conference, a data transformation conference in analytics engineering. And back in my day, like Kimball was like kind of the thing you would be doing. So it's interesting in some sense because I think the argument is for, just make like one big table that has everything. And it seems like a lot of the formal techniques, at least in this sample size, but I think anecdotally, Matt and I have seen the same things where the modern crop of analytics engineers, the old school techniques of data modeling may not actually be known, which I think is very interesting as well. So
yeah. I mean, that's fascinating. And I think like it also kind of points to the fact that, as you were saying before, like a lot of the kind of like communities around like the modern data stack are also becoming increasingly cliquish. So I think, it's also highly likely that like many of the people with whom I engage and some of the people who are like driving these conversations about these tools and platforms may have like more experience with data modeling. It's almost like an interesting manifestation of Conway's law that you have like this culture of analytics engineering that may be emerging around like a set of people who know how to use that tool best.
For sure. It's funny you mentioned that. I'm actually in the middle of writing a book on data modeling right now. And it's funny you mentioned Conway's law because this is going to be a central theme in the book. And I'm debating whether or not it's going to be like data product modeling or something like that. But it's the attempt to, I guess, introduce some sort of, process while just being good enough. I think there's a trade-off, right? Where it's on one hand, it's fast versus formal is kind of how I look at stuff. Formal being you're going to spend pretty much your entire career just modeling data, which never sees the light of day is from what I've seen. And fast meaning we'll just make a query that'll answer the question that this person's asking, and then you keep repeating that over and over and over again for I don't know how many permutations of that question, and you kind of get the opposite result, which is just kind of query sprawl. And so but the thing is, what Matt and I have noticed is that the modern data stack doesn't really. I mean, it's interesting. I love the way you frame this, where it's a focus on. I think a lot of the technologies, for example, as far as I could tell that you're saying, but the practices I think still need to be consolidated to some degree or agreed upon. But as you say, it's very cliquish, and Conway's law is in effect, so you kind of get the result of that, which is I think extreme fragmentation in some ways of processes and practices and so forth. But I love your take because I mean we talked to a lot of different people, so I don't know that we have an answer, but.
Yeah. I mean, I think like, so this is part of the reason why I say like today, like we're kind of like settling into the modern data stack. I mean, I'd love to hear kind of like your point of view, but like, I think you could argue that like DBT is a tool that is well suited, like at a minimum, like good enough to implement dimensional data modeling. So to like implement like sound data modeling practice. But now, the people who have the tool need to like learn the methodology. I wonder if like what we're seeing is a little bit of like kind of like polarization where like some people are not implementing, best practice in terms of Kimball, et cetera. And then there are others that are at kind of the extreme of we're just going to like keep iterating on our data models until we have, this like perfect representation of the data. And I think like there's somewhere in the middle that is ideal, where your core data models, as I was saying, can help people answer kind of basic, recurring, easily anticipated questions. But beyond that, you accept that like some ad hoc analysis needs to be quick and dirty, and you may not need a data model to like answer a question about some trends that just needs to be like directionally correct. So I think like on both sides, we need to like learn what good looks like, not what perfect looks like.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the thing too, you bring up, kind of data-rich applications, for example, right? Interactive apps, which I'm assuming has some sort of a real-time element to it, or at least a faster element than just once a day batch or whatever. And it's interesting when you look at modeling techniques in that case too, and we'll turn to the discussion of data modeling, but just to bring a point, there really aren't that many I would see that are widely used. There's Data Vault, which I think is gaining popularity, but I don't. At the same time, it seems like it might be a lot more effort than I would see a lot of teams wanting to invest in that practice. And so, I'm interested to see what happens from a formal practice in terms of interactive data modeling, for example, because it seems like it's a much different beast than kind of the way we've done things before. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think like I also have questions around like who will be building these like user-facing data applications in the future. When I've talked to a lot of people about like how their external facing data applications were developed, like for the most part, it is like product engineers that are building those data applications. And so like in kind of exploring this ecosystem, one of the questions that I've had is will we find tools that make, data modeling that make building kind of like rich analytical applications easier for product engineers? Or, will we have tools that enable data practitioners to kind of like adapt to the user-facing product setting?
That's a very interesting question. And I, from my perspective, part of the issue here is organizational, where maybe it needs to be both. And we need to tear down some traditional walls that have existed between, like back-end systems teams, building the interactive product, working with transactional databases, and the other side of the wall, which is the analytics side, right? And that's a consistent theme we see all the time. Communications across that wall, failures of communication specifically cause all kinds of problems.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I think like those walls are pretty sturdy.
They seem to be. They're still
Sturdier than
here.
the one that, yeah. Well, it's like one of the things that was eye-opening for me. So in navigating this question, I started to talk to like more and more like product engineers about like how they work with data. And I was like really surprised by just how many developers either don't use or like don't want to use SQL. So I think like in thinking about these walls, like one seems to be like very clearly like a language barrier. SQL is undoubtedly like the lingua franca of analytics engineers. Perhaps Python like helps like nudge like other data practitioners like into a kind of language setting that aligns a little bit more with product engineers. But when you have like SQL and JavaScript, those things are not that easy to integrate, and I think certainly almost impose like different mental models in thinking about data and thinking about applications and how those things intersect.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's one of the things I've been researching a ton and writing about, and also having done it before too as a
Mhm.
backend engineer. You think in terms of if you're using like an ORM, for example, an object relational mapper to write your application. This is
Mhm.
the other crux on the I see too, where application is actually it's because it sits upstream from data systems. And ORMs give you pretty much any amount of liberty to write data models. um, these data models are often very, I would say, interesting. They're not third normal form, for example. They're like probably maybe one normal form, maybe half normal form. But the whole problem is that this has downstream effects, right? Because now you have
Mhm.
duplicate data, for example. Now you have all the weird stuff that gets introduced upstream. Your analytics engineers, your data engineers get to deal with down there. And so, but again, I even find data modeling techniques in with application developers is sorely lacking. Like they may be familiar with normal forms, but it's not like the code I've seen is rarely enforced. It's not like people sit there with an ERD and map out what the data model is going to look like. It's like, oh, I just need to add another field to this model. I'll just add it in real quick, push it up, and it works. It usually works pretty well, and that's just it. It's good enough, right? And until your database scales to a big size, and then you have problems. So, but but at the end of the day, too, what I do notice is a lot of this activity. It's more common at startups, for example, or smaller companies where the name of the game is moving fast. Like I don't have time to sit here and you know spend 5 months working on a nice ERD diagram for my app and build that. It's like not going to happen.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
but what
Well,
are
I think
what are
like
some of the other? Oh, go on.
well, I was just going to say, I think like in part, like for those reasons, like we actually see like an absence of kind of like richer data applications that are available to consumers. Like it's funny
Yeah.
because we're at the end of the year, which means that like Spotify like does their like end of the year user insights thing, and people go crazy over that. Like if you think about like what that data is, like it is basically like a simpler experience than like most executive dashboards that exist today. Um, but things like that I think are like shockingly difficult to build, um, uh, in part because I think we have like this isolation of kind of like the full stack engineering expertise and
Mhm.
the data expertise, which gets entrenched by kind of like the lack of tools for product engineers to work with data in more complex ways, and for data practitioners to uh, build user-facing products that are able to kind of like stand up to the demands of web-scale companies and their users.
So we talked about interactive applications. Where else do you think things are moving? Either alongside or I guess leaping off from the modern data stack.
Yeah, I love that question because I think like one of the things that sometimes dismays me in the vein of this goal-driven analysis is that like we don't have as much conversation, or at least like open conversation about like what can be done with data, like what you
Mm.
can build. Um, uh, Certainly, I think like one area that I've been excited about like for a while is experimentation. I think certainly like given the like challenging market conditions, experimentation is absolutely critical, um, to enabling companies to really understand like the ROI associated with their product bets, so that they can continue to like make advances. They're not stagnating, um, but they can get smarter about how they're spending money. I also just love experimentation because I think like it just kind of like clearly unifies like data and decisions. This notion that like you're going to define an experiment, um, based on a decision that you want to make, I think is kind of like an elegant manifestation of that idea of goal-driven analysis in certain ways. Um, but there's kind of a whole range of things from like uh, better like pricing analysis, um, uh, to better product analytics that I think is possible. We just need to like lift our heads up and think about like the biggest opportunities to like actually make an impact. And think more clearly about the decisions that need to be made, the strategic goals of a company, and kind of like lining up the data practice and platform behind that. Of course, the other kind of obvious answer to that question is that like there is a lot of excitement around like MLAI use cases today. There's somewhat of like a mismatch in that I think that like a lot of the models and model APIs that are kind of like fueling this new hype cycle are probably best suited for unstructured data versus like your core data models. But I think that could change. And what feels different compared to like 2017, 2018, the last time we saw kind of this burgeoning interest in MLAI is that like the new APIs, like they really do kind of like lower the barrier to entry of like experimenting with machine learning. You really don't need, at least to like prototype something, like see how it might impact like your users, etc. You really don't need ML researchers or engineers anymore. So I'm excited to see how that kind of continues to evolve.
Anything in particular in ML or AI that excites you right now, apart from the chatbots and whatnot, or there? Well, I guess I get your newsletter, for example, which is awesome, and you read a lot of papers. Have there been any papers in ML or AI recently that's come about? There's like, holy crap, that's amazing. So.
I mean, the results that like people are getting with these pre-trained models, particularly like with an approach called instruction tuning, it really is incredible. Like if you like interact with Chat GPT, I think like it doesn't take like much time to be like, okay, fine, this is a breakthrough. Like there's something to the hype. I do still think, though, as I mentioned earlier, like there's a bit of a mismatch between the data types that organizations are most accustomed to working with, including like the data types that they actually have and have access to, which have largely been like tabular and time series data, and the data types for which these models are best suited. I actually have seen though a couple of attempts to like use these language models on structured data, or to like integrate structured data into the like LLM capabilities, which seems somewhat promising. There also have been some efforts to actually like automate some aspects of like either data preparation, data cleaning, et cetera, which are also pretty interesting.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting too. I talked with Bill Inman quite a bit. He came up with the data warehouse and for structured data. But I think even like 10 plus years ago or something like that, he decided to focus on unstructured data and text. He's like, that's most of the data in a corporation. It's actually not the structured data. I'm actually going to go hang out with him tomorrow. He's going to show me some cool techniques with unstructured data modeling. But that was interesting to bring that up, because I was thinking a lot about this too with these large language models and how it might be brought into an enterprise, for example, right? I think there's it seems like there's a lot of potential, obviously, because a lot of the power of these data sets is they're private, right?
Yeah.
Internal to a corporation. So if you could find some sort of an insight from those that you wouldn't necessarily glean from the traditional ways of doing structured data modeling, I think that could open up a whole new world of possibilities, plus audio and video and everything else under the sun too. So
yeah. I mean, I also think like in that vein, like there are kind of like exciting possibilities to unify unstructured and structured data.
Oh yeah.
When Coalesce, the DBT conference happened, usertesting.com actually had like their own conference, a floor below Coalesce.
Interesting.
And I remember thinking to myself, like, this is so interesting. You certainly at like both conferences, like have a set of people who are interested in better understanding how people are using their product today and leveraging those insights to inform the product direction. But so rarely do we think about kind of like combining like qualitative data that might be gleaned through things like user interviews with more quantitative data that is often like gleaned by like using like metrics, events, et cetera. So it's an area that I think like doesn't often like get that much attention, but like in my point of view, like data teams ought to be like pretty good at like working with like qualitative data too, like survey data, videos of user sessions and things like that. And I definitely don't see that today.
Did you skip out on the coalescence? Did you go to the user conference downstairs? Or?
I mean, I should have, but I felt like I would have been like a little bit of a traitor since one of my portfolio companies competes with user testing.
It's not
Their product is much better.
Obligation.
It's like a fake mustache on there or something. Yeah.
Yeah, seriously.
I have to say, I'm excited. I mean, I think it's still early with these models, right? We're doing really exciting stuff. It's still early. We're going to see a lot more improvement and a lot more problems solved. But I'm excited to see things like using these models to generate SQL, for example. So where we're actually combining traditional techniques, but we're maybe asking questions and saying, write a query to do this, right? There's been quite a bit of interest in automated code generation, for example, or at least code checking using models like this. On Twitter, you actually tweeted about specifically OpenAI and both the potential and limitations. And I think, what are your thoughts on, we've talked a bit about the potential. What are you seeing in terms of the limitations that maybe are being overlooked in the current hype cycle?
Yeah. So I mean, I think like in terms of the potential and limitations, a lot of this actually comes down to like understanding like how good the models are today versus how reliable we need things to be in order to kind of like productize them. If you can go from like 70% precision and recall to like 90% precision and recall with a model, like that is huge. It is a dramatic improvement, but it's also like not good enough for many use cases. And I think you see this pretty clearly with like Chat GPT. Like if something gives you a wrong answer, even like 1 in 20 times, like that's probably not good enough to like use in your like professional, possibly even like aspects of your personal life. What I think is interesting though is thinking about like these like human machine loops and like how we can almost use these models as kind of like AI assistants. You see this very much with like things like Copilot, like probably not good enough to like not review your code. Forget probably, like definitely not good enough to like not review your code. Like you're not just going to say like, I'm going to build an app and like Copilot is going to automatically like debug it or automatically perform like performance analysis and implement these like performance improvements. But it's good enough to like accelerate your own workflow. And I think like finding these use cases where like it's good enough to accelerate your workflow is pretty exciting. And there's a lot of potential in that. There's a lot of potential in something that is, a like 90% automated solution with 10% like additional human effort, even if that 10% ends up becoming kind of more like 20% given some of the dynamics of working with these models.
For sure. It reminds me of when I was a kid, the web browser came out. I was actually an early beta tester for Mosaic way back in the day. And the effects of this actually reminds me a lot of the impact of what these language models are going to have. In the sense where it just brings the information forward in ways that, I mean, because back in the day I was a dorky kid on Usenet and stuff like that. And now it's like, now all of a sudden I have web pages and all this, you know, and the data becomes more interconnected. And I think in much the same way, these chat models are just going to bring about just a new way of just interacting with data and with other people. The interesting thing is I had a post the other day on LinkedIn, right? You're definitely going to, I fear you're going to see basically the same as like SEO spam happening with these models. And so, you know, people are going to definitely try and game the results. So that's going to be very fascinating to watch. And the governance around that is what I'm actually very interested in seeing. Lord knows what's going to show up in these things.
Yeah. Well, you already have problems going back to what you were saying, Sarah, about needing to check your work. Supposedly people are uploading, you know, automating Stack Overflow answers using ChatGPT, which generates some good answers and some garbage and some stuff that's in between. And
but they all look great on the surface, right?
The details. It's all very confident. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is reminding me too. So like, you know, when I look at like the modern data stack as like an investor today, I feel like there's like very little white space that remains in terms of like things for which there is not a tool that is like good enough. That's not to say that like, you know, you can't like build a better data warehouse. I think like there are opportunities to like leverage compute more efficiently and so on and so forth. But like one of the areas where I think there is still probably white space has been like instrumentation and event collection. You know, I think we can be like far more intentional about like what data we are collecting, including to enable this paradigm of goal-driven analysis. But I've been thinking a lot about this too in the context of these language models, because like they rely so heavily on like user feedback. But like, what does instrumentation for a you know, LM driven application look like? Like, do we need to approach like events and metrics and logs differently to like somehow you know, collect additional signal that might reveal whether or not something was like machine generated or not? Like, do we even need to like structure the data at all? I think like both for like traditional applications and for these ML driven applications, like we will and probably like need to see new approaches to collecting behavioral data.
Yeah, I agree. That's really interesting. I think Matt and I are going to go ponder that one for a bit. There's what's interesting too is that there's going to be a feedback loop between the actions taken on these models, for example, and then the data you might be collecting back. And so this will be very interesting. Gosh, the ability to game stuff is going to be pretty crazy.
Well, what I'll add to what you were saying, Sarah, about the white space is I think where a lot of the white space is right now is like synthesizing these different techniques. So, for example, take a database, but then put a chatbot driven front end on it, and then another interpretation layer that maybe can give you a text interpretation of the result that comes back, and also maybe build a dashboard for you or something. I don't know. Like, it seems like there are tons and tons of opportunities, which is sort of what Joe's getting at as well, right? Like, combining different tools, people are going to find all kinds of new interesting ways to hack, and it's going to get crazy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think like it's funny. There have been some conversations about like language models displacing databases, and I think like those are a little bit silly, because like a database is not just a like query engine. Like there are a set of like transaction guarantees, et cetera, that like many databases like afford that actually enable us to like build products like relatively sanely. So I don't think that like LMs are going to replace databases anytime soon, but like being able to connect like a language model with a database, I think can be like incredibly powerful. Being able to kind of like route queries to determine like, can this be most effectively answered through a language model, through a programming language, through a database. I think like these kind of integrated approaches will allow us to kind of like bend the limits of you know, what language models can and cannot do. But they may also require us to kind of like develop, as I was saying before, like new approaches to instrumentation, new approaches to tracing, and so on.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of switching gears a bit. I think in our chat before the show, databases is also something on your mind. I also noticed that there was an investment in MotherDoc, which is I think getting a lot of capturing the public's imagination right now. Walk me through this. What's on your mind with databases, and specifically, I'd like to know your thesis around MotherDoc.
Yeah, absolutely. So in some ways, I feel like databases is like one of the easiest categories to invest in because if they're good, they always make money. That's an exaggeration, but like time has kind of like borne out that like people will buy a faster, cheaper database, particularly if it's 10x faster, 10x cheaper, and like can also like reduce management overhead. Um, uh, Time has also borne out that like with advances in technologies, it is typically possible to create a 10x faster, 10x cheaper database. Um, so I feel like databases is almost like an eternal investment thesis. Like there will always be better databases. The question becomes like, what actually unlocks these better databases? And I think like part of our hypothesis with MotherDuck really kind of hinged upon two ideas. One is that data warehouse is just like one step in the direction of full separation of compute and storage. Perhaps like the next step is not just separation of compute and storage, but separation of compute and storage and storage, which is to say that like compute exists in different surface areas. And if we leverage that compute more effectively, we can perhaps build 10x faster, 10x cheaper databases. I think the other insight there, and this actually relates to some of our conversations about core data modeling and goal-driven analysis, is really that like a lot of databases that exist today, they were designed for big data, but big data may not actually be what we need. If you think about like these practices of core data modeling, if you think about like some of the needs around like tricks, and if you think about like the idea of goal-driven analysis, like all of these are actually ways to filter down big data. And so I think, a core insight of the kind of MotherDoc team is about like the need for data systems that enable fast, easy access to small data or like moderately, rightly sized data, versus like platforms that can query, a petabyte of data in a couple of milliseconds. Like how often do you actually really need to, or how often should you be querying a petabyte of data?
I think what excites me as well is the notion of hybridization. And we saw this with the internet. So there's kind of been this pendulum swinging in computing, which you alluded to, separation, compute, and storage and such. But I'm more thinking of like centralization versus decentralization. So if you go way back, they had timeshare computers, and then you had the PC, and people had their own computers. And then with phone apps and JavaScript apps, all of a sudden you had this hybrid where a lot of computing could happen remotely and a lot of computing could happen locally. And so I think what I'd like to see eventually with MotherDoc is a hybridization of like big data, where the big data stuff can happen remotely.
Yep.
And the small data stuff can happen super fast on the edge. And we're already seeing that. I mean, it's incredible what they're doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think like hybrid query execution is kind of like a step in that direction, and an important one. We're also seeing like a lot of like interesting projects in data visualization that kind of enable this paradigm of like more effectively leveraging like the client and server, given the chart or data viz that you want to produce. And I think we will see more of that in the future. This is probably like one of those areas where hybrid query execution, better leveraging compute where it exists, like still a little bit researchy. And I do think that like it's an area where like research progress will enable even better paradigms in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, it's super cool. Interested to see what happens too. Yeah, I remember because Jordan was on our show talking about Mother Duck, and I think we just had him on the show because I was like, I'm intrigued by the name. Just tell me more. And it's like he describes it, and we're sitting there like, huh, that's really fascinating. So you basically, it's I kind of joked to myself, it was sort of like Microsoft Access sees like sort of a new day, but it's not that way, of course. But the local angle is very fascinating in that regard. So it took a second for it to click. It wasn't like it was immediate. Right?
Really
Oh
did.
yeah, this made a lot of sense, right? But I think it was Bailey Hayes who was at a single store. She had a demo at my meetup. She's showing off a Wasm. Being able to play like a real-time video game. I was like, okay, that's cool. Like that's probably one of the coolest demos I've ever seen. So yeah, and it's fascinating too, because the questions comes up all the time. Like, okay, so why would I need a small database on my computer? Why can't I just do BigQuery? But as Jordan said, it's not so much big data, it's much like easy data, right? He called it easy query at Google. So yeah, that's interesting. And any other database technologies exciting you right now?
I do still see like a lot of potential in the HTAP paradigm. As I mentioned before, I feel like a lot of like data warehouses that exist today, they weren't designed to support like the development of web applications. It's not kind of in their foundations. Now, an open question for me is like with improvements in things like real-time CDC, where like you can easily like sync your transactional database and OLAP database. Like, do we need kind of the hybrid model? But certainly, I think at scale, like managing those types of like connections starts to impose more and more of a burden. And I think it's interesting to think about like how can we make it easy to operationalize data, analytical data, including through the HTAP paradigm. I'm also seeing kind of this need to be able to like operationalize transformed data for like web application purposes, manifest in the form of like derived data stores. So like I think in the past 2 to 3 months, like Airbnb, LinkedIn, and I believe like one other kind of like web scale company released blog posts on their derived data stores. They often kind of like describe how they are pushing data from analytical systems into these derived data stores to power applications like experimentation or machine learning and so on. As an investor, like when I start seeing like the web scale companies like release similar tools, like after I see something like 3-4 times, it probably suggests that like that's something that could maybe will go mainstream within the next couple of years. So things like Venice and Venice from LinkedIn, Muscle from Airbnb, like those are things I'm paying attention to too.
That's cool. Yeah, I was gonna have Felix, one of the engineers on Venice, on the show pretty soon. So it's gonna be a great chat. Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Awesome.
So yeah, that's interesting. I hope that a lot of the kind of mainstream providers right now for analytics data warehouses, that the cost, what trips us up is we get a lot of requests for kind of either like building an enriched data app or embedded analytics is a big one, right? But you look at the cost profiles of these data warehouses, for example, and you're going to get eaten alive if you have thousands of concurrent queries. like you'll probably literally go out of business if you don't have.
They're just not designed for that. Yeah.
No.
And you really can like drive insane spending. And I think that is part of the problem here. I think what we have right now is a better version of what we've had since the 1980s, that we're all building much better versions of the mousetrap, right? Like much better MPPs, which are awesome. But then the question is, okay, but what if we want to get beyond that MPP paradigm that we've had since the 80s?
Yeah. It's funny. My colleague Natalie often says that like, Snowflake is just Oracle in the cloud. And there's something to that.
well, look at the roots of it. So yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, should be exciting to see where things go. Yeah, cool. So wrapping it up for people who want to learn more about you, how can they do that?
That's a good question. I tweet probably too much at SarahCat21. There's kind of more information, including my contact information, available on our website too, which is just amplifypartners.com.
Cool, awesome. As always, a pleasure talking to you. So yeah, it's been a great show. I feel like we keep talking, but at the top of the hour. So, and a lot of questions. And sorry we didn't get to any of the questions from the audience. I guess we're having so much fun talking that we forgot all the questions. So.
Sorry, I didn't even see.
Like, no, this is a great conversation.
Yeah.
This is the problem associated with like browser extensions. I like didn't even see that there was a chat because I had a browser extension that was blocking it. So apologies.
Oh, whoops.
But,
Oh well, next time.
yeah.
So,
Maybe we need to have another chat, like 6 months or something. We can talk
the
more.
Q&A.
AMA basically instead. Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome back on the show anytime. So, speaking of shows, next week we have Serge from SQL DBM. I guess we're going to be talking about SQL and data modeling, super riveting topics. Then we're going to take a break, and I think it's January 9th. Chip Hoyen is going to be on the show. So, we're going to talk about productionizing machine learning and whatever else is on our mind. So, we got a very stacked roster for 2023. So I think we're booked out all the way to the end of March, early April. So it's gonna be a lot of fun. Awesome. Well, we'll see everybody next week. Sarah, I hope you have a great time, great holiday. So thanks to the audience.
Thank you.
See you all soon.
You too. Have a good one. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Thanks for joining.